The chlorine stung my eyes, but I didn't mind. The heat in Houston had been unbearable all season, and my pool was the only thing stopping me from losing my cool. I had invested a good portion of my savings into transforming my backyard into a private paradise when I bought this place last year, dreaming of lazy afternoons with a drink in hand. Today was supposed to be one of those afternoons, just me, the sun, and the refreshing embrace of cool water. But then Linda showed up. Now, I don't often throw that name around, but there was no other way to describe her. She practically radiated with the kind of entitled frustration that could make anyone's blood boil. A towering hairstyle, oversized sunglasses, and a scowl that could sour milk. She was a walking caricature of suburban angst. I later found out her name was Linda Roberts. "Excuse me," she shouted from across the wrought iron fence, her voice bouncing off the pool float like an annoying echo. "Are you aware that this is a private community?" I pulled my head above the water, pushing on my goggles with a sigh. "Yes, Linda, I am. I own the house and the pool," I replied. Her face twisted in disbelief. "I've never seen you before, and I certainly don't recognize you as a resident. You need to leave immediately." I could feel my frustration building. This was ridiculous. I tried to keep my cool, but it wasn't easy. "Look, I assure you, I live here. I have the mortgage to prove it. And even if I didn't, what's it to you?" That's when her backup arrived. A young man in swim trunks who looked like he had just rolled out of bed appeared by her side. He resembled her, less angry, but still the same kind of entitled. Trailing behind him was a man in a police uniform. My heart skipped a beat. "This is my son, Kyle," Linda announced with puffed-up pride, "and this is Officer Davis." She gestured to the man in uniform, who looked as thrilled to be there as I was to be dealing with this. Officer Davis gave a curt nod. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he was waiting for me to start crying any second. "Mrs. Roberts has concerns about an unauthorized individual using a private pool. Can you provide identification?" I felt the slow burn of indignation creeping up my neck. "This is insane," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I live here. I can show you my driver's license inside. Can we just go get it?" Before Officer Davis could reply, Linda snapped, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. She's probably lying. She must have broken in." "Officer, I demand you remove her from my property now," she added, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. Officer Davis, looking like he wished he were anywhere but here, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Roberts, I understand your concerns, but I need to follow procedure. Ma'am, if you could just provide some identification." I sighed, rolling my eyes. "Fine," I said, lifting myself out of the pool, leaving a trail of water behind me. "I'll be right back." But Linda wasn't having it. Fueled by a combination of her own entitled rage and what I could only assume was heat exhaustion, she decided to take matters into her own hands. "Kyle," she barked, "get in there and get her out of my pool." Kyle, poor guy, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mom, I don't think—" "No, get her out," she shrieked. With a resigned sigh, Kyle stepped into the pool, the water barely reaching his ankles. "Seriously, Kyle?" Linda yelled. "You're just going to stand there? Get moving." Before I could even react, Linda, with surprising agility for her age, dove into the pool. The splash hit Kyle, soaking him completely and causing him to yelp in surprise. She wasn't after him, though. She was after me. Her manicured hands reached out like claws, grabbing for my arm. "Get out of my pool," she screamed, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked like they'd never seen a gym. I recoiled, trying to hold my ground while battling a woman who clearly thought she was the star of a drama. "Linda, stop. You're going to hurt yourself." But reason had long since abandoned Linda Roberts. She was on a mission to protect her idealized suburban world, and I was the unwelcome intruder. She yanked me, pulling me toward the shallow end of the pool. Officer Davis, who had been watching all of this unfold with the stunned look of someone witnessing a slow-motion car crash, finally seemed to snap out of his trance. "Mrs. Roberts," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "That's enough. You can't just—" Linda, her adrenaline pumping, ignored him. She pinned me against the side of the pool. "Kyle, help me get her out," she screamed. Kyle looked like he'd rather disappear into thin air. "Mom, this is getting out of hand," he muttered. The officer, apparently realizing he had no choice, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his tone finally firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to let go of her now." Linda glared at him, but eventually loosened her grip, allowing me to scramble away. I stood there, dripping wet and furious, as Officer Davis guided me back to the edge of the pool. "Ma'am," he said, "I understand this is a difficult situation, but Mrs. Roberts has raised valid concerns. I need to see your identification." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Valid concerns? She just tried to drown me, and you're taking her side?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I need to verify you live here, ma'am." That was it. I'd had enough. The heat, the chlorine, the audacity of Linda Roberts, it was all too much. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about power and assumptions. It was about the subtle ways prejudice could show up in the most mundane situations. "Officer," I said, my voice calm but firm, "before I provide you with any identification, I need to ask you a question." He raised an eyebrow, clearly impatient. "What's that?" "May I see your badge?" I asked. He blinked. "My badge? What for? Just show it to me." I insisted. He hesitated, but pulled a tarnished badge from his pocket. I examined it closely, noticing the font seemed a little off, the edges too smooth. "Thank you," I said, handing it back. "Now I'm going to ask you another question. What precinct are you assigned to?" He shifted uncomfortably. "That's not really relevant, ma'am." "It is relevant," I insisted. "Answer the question." He mumbled something unintelligible. "Speak up, officer." "I can't hear you." He finally blurted out, "Precinct 3. And what's your badge number?" 47B32, he stammered. I nodded slowly. "Thank you, Officer Davis. I appreciate your cooperation." My heart was pounding as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. 911, "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "I need to report a fraudulent police officer," I said, my voice shaky. "His name is Davis, badge number 47B32. He claims to be from Precinct 3. I believe he's impersonating law enforcement." I gave the dispatcher my address and a brief summary of the situation, doing my best to remain calm. I could see Linda and Kyle staring at me, their expressions a mix of confusion and growing worry. The fake officer, Davis, seemed ready to bolt, but I was faster. I grabbed his arm, my grip tight. "Not so fast, Officer Imposter," I said. Within minutes, the Real police arrived. 2 uniformed officers in the proper gear. Davis, realizing the jig was up, went limp, allowing me to easily hold him in place until they took over. The scene became a whirlwind of flashing lights and shouting voices. The real officers quickly discovered that Officer Davis was a fraud, a man named Barry Jones who had bought the uniform and badge online. As the real officers led Barry Jones away in cuffs, Linda and Kyle stood frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. The scene that had started with a heated confrontation now felt surreal, like something out of a bizarre comedy. I couldn't help but shake my head as I watched them, realizing that this had never been about a pool or even a misunderstanding. It was about control. Linda had assumed she could dictate who belonged and who didn't, her sense of entitlement blinding her to reality. Once everything settled, the officers apologized for the inconvenience, but I was too relieved to care. I stood there, still dripping wet, feeling the rush of vindication. It was more than just a battle over property. It was a fight for dignity and respect. Sometimes, people think they can walk over others, especially when they hold a little bit of power, whether real or imagined. As the officers drove away and my backyard returned to its quiet solitude, I couldn't help but laugh. The kind of person who would go to such lengths to make someone feel small was certainly no match for the resolve of someone who knew their worth. Today, my backyard oasis had become something far more meaningful, a reminder that standing up for yourself matters, no matter how absurd the situation may seem.